Chapter 18 of Mr. Wicker's Window by Carley Dawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This recording by Arthur Piantadosi. It was perhaps as well that Chris had more than enough to think of. Otherwise the wrench at leaving home might have been even more distressing than it was. His last day passed like a flash, though from his attitude no one, certainly not Becky, would have guessed that the next morning he would not be there to eat his breakfast in the sunny kitchen window. Amos, quick to sense all of Chris's moods, knew something was afoot. When Chris and Mr. Wicker finally told him of the sailing plan, Amos's eyes grew rounder than ever and sparkled more brightly, but he said never a word. At 10 o'clock that night, when Becky had gone heavily to her room, wondering perhaps why Chris had given her so hard a hug, Ned Silly walked to the back door. He had brought a lighted cart on which there stood a large wicker hamper. Ned and Chris lifted it into the kitchen where Mr. Wicker drew the curtains and held a candle high. The candlelight flickered and flamed up like a trapped bird at the corners of the room, and sharp bird-winged shadows caught across Mr. Wicker's tall, dark figure. Yet to Chris, who was to hold the scene ever after in his memory, the kitchen by the light of that one candle and the figure of his master standing in its center moved Chris as he had never been touched before. Amos stood near the basket, looking first into its square depth filled with shadow, and then up, inquiring at Mr. Wicker, but he did not speak. "Be of good heart, Amos," Mr. Wicker told him kindly, "and look after young Christopher as best you can." Then, as a gesture from Mr. Wicker, Amos agog stepped into the hamper where he stood uncertainly, his expression half terrified and half delighted. "Yes, sir, I will," he piped up, shriveled excitement. "I'll keep my eye on him." He promised and then curled up in the hamper. Ned Silly shut down the top, and he and Chris lifted it to the cart. Mr. Wicker spoke low in Ned's ear. "All is well understood?" he inquired. "This is no time for misunderstandings." Aye, sir. All is clear," the good Ned replied. "Then God speed you all and bring you safely home," said Mr. Wicker. "Be on the lookout for this lad, Ned, when you get past the bar." "We shall," Ned whispered back, "and good luck to the two of you." Clucking to the horse on wheels covered with rags and with cloths about the horse's hooves to deaden their sound, Ned Silly and the hamper went quietly up in the direction of the wharves. In a moment, cart, horse, and driver were swallowed up in the denseness of the night. A black night it was indeed. Although there was a moon, the clouds scudded over it, and an autumn wind bent the trees, tearing the leaves from them. A mist rose from the river, but it was blown away from all but the most sheltered places. Mr. Wicker and Chris stood in the silent kitchen. Looking about him, Chris remembered with a pang the first morning he'd seen it, with Becky in her gaudy hat standing near the fire. "Come on, Christopher," Mr. Wicker bade him, taking up his cape black cloak and another one for Chris. "First, wind the rope about your waist, and once on board, bind it under your shirt. Let no one, not even Amos, know of it." Chris stood as he was told. Mr. Wicker then gave him a leather pouch hung on a cord. "Here are some ointments of magic that may prove their usefulness," he remarked. "Wear them about your neck." So saying, he slipped the leather cord around over Chris's head. "What happens to the rope and pouch when I change my shape, sir?" Chris asked. "They will remain with you. Have no fear of that," Christian replied. "What would be the use of magic if it proved unable to adjust itself?" A smile played over Mr. Wicker's face. "So all is ready," he said, glancing around. "Now we must be off and lose no time, for we have much ahead of us," said Mr. Wicker dryly, blowing out the candle. Before he knew it, Chris stood, until what far off time, outside Mr. Wicker's house. His master locked the door. The wind, swooping down like some great bird, tugged at their cloaks and chilled their faces. Chris led the way to the creek and the marsh, but at this time both he and Mr. Wicker wore high boots which kept the icy water and mud from their feet. "What I wouldn't give for a flashlight," Chris muttered as he came to the marsh. "Yes, the 20th century has many conveniences," Mr. Wicker replied, and Chris could imagine, behind him, the man's sardonic smile and amused eyes. They came out suddenly from the blackness of the woods to the wind-whipped river, and though the moon was still obscured, the river held a pallid sheen of its own that gave a little light. There was not a sound to be heard but the hurried lap of water against the shore, the suck and pull of Chris and Mr. Wicker's boots in the mud, and the sharp, hair-raising rustles from time to time in the reeds. Chris's heart thudded in his throat as these furtive noises, for they could only be made by rats or water snakes, and Chris liked neither of these, especially at night. Pushing along the marsh edge and feeling their way, the two figures at last came in sight of their goal. The high, dark hull of the Venture rose above the water, an amber lantern hanging in her stern. The wind swung the ship, and the tide, still flowing up the Potomac, showed that the bow held by the anchor was pointed somewhere upstream. "The anchor may have dragged," Chris whispered to Mr. Wicker. "Now for our boat." The rope seemed to uncoil from about its waist almost of itself, and with the gestures he had been taught, Chris formed a very adequate craft, a little trifle lopsided, it must be admitted, as he had small practice, but seaworthy nonetheless. "I shall see that the men sleep soundly," Mr. Wicker murmured. "You do the rest." "I shall, sir," Chris agreed, and then the moon showed an edge for the moment in the clouds. "Look, sir, the Mirabelle!" Towards sleeping Georgetown, for it was nearly midnight now, a whiteness showed itself closer against the distant wharves. The Mirabelle was edging out, and Chris knew that Ned, Bowie, Abner, Cloud, and the others were pulled up by the ship's boats into the main flow of the river. Once turned, she would float noiselessly down the Potomac past the Venture, and once he was aboard, would hoist her sails and set her course to sea. "Then quick," made Miss Wicker. "We took too long. We are a trifle late." They stepped into the boat, each taking an oar, and with only a few small pulls came alongside the silent Venture. They moored their boat to the anchor rope. Mr. Wicker touched Chris by way of wishing him luck and disappeared. For half a second more Chris waited. No sound came from the ship, but a light showed in the captain's cabin. In a twinkling, a monkey with a pouch about its neck ran up the anchor rope and, pausing on the gunwale, sniffed at the pungent flower smell that it now knew meant sleep for all the sailors. Then it bounded toward the light. A window of the cabin on the lee side had been left open. Clinging to the piece of rigging before it spread to the sill, the monkey's eyes caught what seemed to be a shadow darker than that of the mist of the night, moving away from the sailor left on night watch. The man now lay slumbered in sleep. The same heady scent of spices and flowers that had overcome Chris when he first entered Mr. Wicker's shop blew away on the gusty wind. The ship tugged and strained at her anchor, wind and turning tide making taut the line that held her close to shore. The Venture, her rigging and mast scarcely visible, so somber was the night, lay ominously silent, excepting for the murmur of voices from the cabin. Abruptly aware of the passing of time and the approaching white cloud on the water that was the Mirabelle, the monkey sprang to the side of the open window and peered inside. A smoking lamp hung low over a center table, dropping a dusky round glow on the larger circle beneath it. Claggett Chew was blearily studying a paper spread out before him, leaning his ugly bare skull on one hand. His eyes were bloodshot, and an empty wine bottle and glass holding only wine dregs showed he'd been drinking and was now half asleep. Osterbridge Hawsey, in a heavy silk robe and embroidered slippers, lounged sideways in a chair with his legs hanging over the arm. His hand trailed an empty glass on the floor, and his silly, drunken smile played over his face. "Claggett," he was saying, "is the place marked? Yup. Oh dear, the hiccups," he complained with a frown. "Let me have more wine." Claggett Chew did not reply, nor rise to fetch another bottle. Osterbridge Hawsey gave another hiccup. Hic! And Hawsey again. "Markin, hic! Claggett, you may forget all those walls to get over or under," he said. "Ah, oh dear, kick! Think of those jewels, Claggett! Dare to take these hiccups!" He exclaimed in a fury of annoyance, but made no motion to change his comfortable condition. "Claggett!" Osterbridge Hawsey snilled. "Are you asleep or angry or put across where that tree is, I say? I want those jewels, Claggett, and so do you. Befuddled, his perspectives hopelessly blurred by excessive wine, Claggett Chew made a mark on a map. "There," he growled, his upper lip drawn back over his teeth. "Will that shut you up?" A moving shadow, duskier than the shadows themselves, came through the door and hovered over Osterbridge Hawsey. Claggett Chew suddenly started up. "I smell him," he murmured thickly. "He's here! Below! White Watchman!" he shouted drunkenly. As he got up, stumbling and thrashing about in the uncertainty of his movements, his chair crashed to the floor and the monkey made a leap, cupping the lantern from its hook. The light was dashed out, and in the dark as he jumped, the monkey seized the creased, well-thumbed paper as he leaped back towards the pale square that was the window. Behind it, Claggett Chew's oaths and explanations became bitter as the spicy smell grew stronger. And at last his mutterings trailed off into snorts and finally snores. The monkey, clutching the paper to itself, sat on the window ledge, stuffing it into the pouch about its neck. And the monkey's smile fluttered around its face as it heard a last dreaming sound from Osterbridge Hawsey. Treacherous! Whoop! Came from Osterbridge Hawsey. Down the anchor rope scrambled the monkey with the agility and speed for which monkeys are famous. Mr. Wicker was already in the boat. "How shall we be, sir?" came the low voice of Chris. "Shall I become a beaver and go down and gnaw the rope off at the anchor?" "No," said Mr. Wicker. "It can be done more easily done than that. Nothing to trace it. Get in the boat. Here comes the Mirabelle." Taking his own shape once more, Chris saw the white ghost-like sides of the Mirabelle soundlessly passing downstream. Not a creak nor a splash of water came from her as she passed, but from the stern a tiny light, struck by a flint perhaps, blinked once and twice, and then a third time. "Now," in Mr. Wicker's voice, "let me have my hand upon that rope." He only seemed to hold the anchor rope a moment, and give it a easy pull. The tugging strain was suddenly gone, and the Venture veered away like a frightened waterfowl. "Will she go where she should, sir?" Chris wanted to know, leaning forward. "That she will, Christopher," came the familiar voice in the dark, "and we must get her out of the way, for here she comes down at us. The wind and the tide and other forces will drive her solidly upon the bar. If I mistake not, it will be several days before they get her off." And on the night air, Verducus heard a faint, short chuckle. "Poor boy," his master told him sharply. "Here she comes." Chris grasped the oar and swung in the boat only in time, for the down-flowing tide and rising wind combined to drive the Venture forward at increasing speed. The tide being still high, the ship was carried well upon the sandbar before it grounded, lolling over on one side, much like the sleeping sailors. "Quick, lad! Now we must catch the Mirabelle, and you and I must part." "Oh, sir!" Chris cried, holding his oar above the water and turning his head toward the man beside him. Mr. Wicker clasped Chris on the shoulder, and the glint of moonlight showed him to be smiling. "I shall miss you too, my lad," he said. "Now, let us send this boat over the river as fast as she can go. And bear in mind to keep your own shape at all times, unless you can change it out of sight of prying eyes." He pulled on the oars. "Oh, yes, I nearly forgot. Among the effects placed in your sea chest, you'll find a conch shell. Hold it to your ear, Christopher, as children do to hear the sea. You will be able to hear my voice, if ever you should need to." "Oh, like a walkie-talkie?" Chris asked, pulling at his oar. "Somewhat," and Chris knew his master smiled at him. "How about getting you to shore, sir?" Chris inquired, pulling in rhythm so that the boat flew down the black and silver river. "Have you forgotten who I am, my boy?" he was asked in return. "No, sir," said Chris, feeling a little small. "Then undo the digging and clamber up the side, for here we are," said Mr. Wicker, and the towering hull of the Mirabelle rose above them. Chris grasped a rope ladder that hung down beside them to the water's edge and turned for a last word. "I'll do my best, sir, but I hope you'll stay with me," he cried. "All that I can, Christopher," came the distant voice. "Godspeed." And looking about, Chris made out, coasting at the air, a seagull, balanced upon its black-tipped wings, swallowing a lump in its throat that proved bothersome. Chris jerked at one oar and deftly coiled the magic rope over his arm, holding to the ship's ladder on the other. A signal flashed, a lantern swung in an arc, and dim figures waited in their places, hauled on the lines. As Chris stopped to the deck over the side, the great white sails rose, spread, and bellied out from the three masts. Chris looked in wonder at as Mirabelle, proud as a woman, lifted up her head. Soon on the silent river only a dwindling sight of lonely sails was to be seen, heading toward Chesapeake Bay and then to sea. But anyone with eyesight good enough might have seen a solitary seagull following. End of Chapter 18 of Mr. Wicker's Window by Carley Dawson.